course, Alexander the Great, the Macedonians, to the Romans, to the Byzantines, and we move on to the Ottoman Empire, which I'd like to skip. That's the 400 years we don't want to remember, of course. Or many of you would know why I would like to skip that. Moving on to modern-day Syria in 1916, part of the deal made of the end of the World War I, the Ottoman Empire was supposed to surrender Syria, Greater Syria. Now remember, from 1,000 years ago until 1916, Syria is the whole part, the geographic part that was bordered by the Syrian desert, what we call, in the Arab Peninsula, southeast, and the Mediterranean Sea, of course, to the west, and Turkey, the mountains of Anatolia to the north. That whole part of the land, that was Syria, Greater Syria. In 1916, when the French and the British were mandated to take control, to colonize Syria from the Ottoman Empire, the first thing they did was divide Syria before they conquered it. Now, many people say, why did they have to do that? Because in 1917, a year later, they had the Balfour Promise to create a Zionist entity in the land of Palestine. We'll come back to Israel, obviously. Let's just move on with Syria. Syria got its independence from France in 1946 as a democratic parliamentary republic. Now, these three words, many of the Arab countries today, they've never used them in their history. Neither democratic, nor republic, nor parliamentary. Okay, Syria has been a parliamentary republic in 1946. The first 20 years, the foreign intervention never left Syria alone. From 46 to about almost 1970, Syria was unstable. Countries still needed a place in Syria, a foot in Syria. They still felt the presence and the importance of being in Syria. The French, the British, the United States, obviously the Israelis, the Egyptians even had a deal, which was a good thing for Syria at the time, a small union, about 3 years. The Saudis, everybody was intervening in Syria. We had 20 different parliament cabinets changed in those 20 years. 4 different constitutions. Until 1963, where the martial law was placed in Syria. That same martial law that was just lifted last year as part of the reform program had been in place since 1963. Many people don't know that. Really, stability didn't happen until the Ba'ath Party came in around 1970. And a new constitution was made for Syria, making Syria a secular society. That same constitution also stayed in place from 1970 till last year as part of the reform program. You're going to hear me say the reform program, I guess, over and over. It's important to know that that constitution made Syria a secular country, a secular society, which provided all its inhabitants equal rights. Women, men, of all ethnicities and all sects. Why Syria went eastward? A lot of people say, why do you want to be friends with Russia? Why don't you be friends with the Americans? Great. Syria did not choose to go eastward until the West has made their decision after the Sinai crisis in 1956 by showing that they made a choice to be with the Zionist state against the Arab, against the Palestinians. They made that choice. France, Britain, and the United States made to be friends with Israel against the Arab and against the Palestinians. We had no choice but to move eastward to build an army. The Egyptians and the Syrians made a pact with the Soviet Union at the time. They built their respective armies for one reason, is to prevent Israel from further taking Arab lands. See, now we can talk a little bit about 1948, when the state or the entity, the Zionist entity, was created in the land of Palestine. That was not its goal. That was not its ultimate goal. If you listen to, back in 1897, Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, he talked about Erez Israel, or Greater Israel, which by chance includes all of Greater Syria. The Fertile Crescent is that what they wanted, from the Nile to the Euphrates. So, also you can listen to Ben-Gurion's speech to the world in 1948. I have that Time magazine. You can read his talking about maybe 100 years, maybe 200 years, but Erez Israel will be once together, will be once united. So the Arabs' stance trying to build an army to deter Israel from further expanding its territory. It's the only country in the world that does not have what you call borders in the United Nations. It doesn't have, it's the only country doesn't have yet fixed or limited borders because they have an expansionist policy. They like to go further. In 1982, they went into Beirut, and if it wasn't for the Lebanese resistance at the time, Israel would be today in Damascus, and we would be speaking Hebrew instead of Arabic right to you right now. So it was not it was forced upon us to build that Syrian army and move with the East plans. And now, if the United States, like I said, was an honest broker and did not 46 vetoed Palestinians' proposition or Palestinian resolutions for an even human, just for basic human rights. Anything to do with the Palestinian people, the United States vetoed. So they made an enemy of us, we didn't make an enemy of them. Obviously, we're going to go quickly, the year 2000 when Bashar al-Assad came into power. That happened to be the same year that the Lebanese resistance in South Lebanon drove Israel out of Lebanon. I think it's a coincidence, but it's a great coincidence because that marked the beginning of a new era in the Arab world, where actually, without starting a war, Israel would take an initiative and withdraw itself with no conditions from an occupied land. So it represented a challenge for Israel and the United States that we want to deal with, which is the resistive forces in the Middle East, supported by mainly Syria. Moving on to 2005, they had their best chance with the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri. We all know they met, President Chirac of France met with George Bush here, what is known as the meeting in France, and they decided this would be our best shot. They started supporting what they called, that they created a resistant or a Syrian opposition to the regime. That didn't work 2005. In 2006, they had a major war offense on South Lebanon to try and take out Hezbollah if they couldn't take out the Syrian government. That war, after 31 days, didn't end but with the conditions that Hezbollah made, which is return of all prisoners of war from Israel. And they didn't stop that war until they got all prisoners of war from Israel. 2008, a war on Gaza didn't help. Again, Gaza were using Syrian-made missiles. We gotta admit it, we say it proudly. We are proud to support resistances in their own land. When you have a people who are being occupied by foreign forces, these people are not terrorists. I don't know why Syria is placed on the axis of evil or this terrorist state, or why Hezbollah is a terrorist state. Hezbollah never left his home in South Lebanon. You have an occupier, an aggressor, taking your land. You have every right to protect and push that occupier out. You can use all the means possible for you. And we are proud. And we are proud as Syrians to have taken a stance with the Lebanese resistance and the Palestinian resistances, including Hamas, even though their last stance with Syria wasn't too honorable, but we will talk about that maybe if we have time a little bit later on. We come into the Arab Spring. Obviously, all else has failed, as you know, with Syria. Syria is still strong and got even stronger. Before we get there, briefly, I'm going to talk about, of course, 9/11 and invasion of Iraq. Now, remember, Israel was placed as a front for the West. That Zionist state was put there in the heart of the Arab lands as a front for the West to protect its interest in the area. For any country that would grow strong enough, they will destroy it. And there was 3 countries that could not be bought by the United States until then. Of course, all the Gulf Emirates, and we know they're all puppets, they were placed by the British and the French colonials to serve their interest. But Iraq, Egypt, and Syria were the 3 superpowers in the region. And they were determined to stop the Israeli aggression and try and return the Arab lands back to the Palestinians. Of course, Egypt was taken out from the equation with the Camp David Accord. Iraq invaded in 2003 based on the biggest lie in the history of humanity. Weapons of mass destruction, which only existed as a graphic image on a UN screen like this here behind me. That was the weapons of mass destruction. And they destroyed that country over that weapons of mass destruction, trying to export to us the freedom that they want us, the freedom and democracy that, in some estimate, have killed over 1 million Iraqis. We know that at least hundreds of thousands of Iraqi kids were affected by the embargo and the sanctions that were there even before the war on Iraq. And these same sanctions have been placed on Syria now. Arab Springs came in as, I believe, a spontaneous reaction in Tunisia. We couldn't talk about conspiracy. I don't think we gotta go that far. It was a populist movement. It was the streets rising up against the dictator, or some people would like to call him whatever they want. Someone who's been in power long enough. And they succeeded. And it didn't take them but a few days because the people believed in what they had to do, or what they were doing. In Egypt, some people talk about something been starting 2 years earlier. I would leave that to other speakers. I'm not very familiar. But we saw what we saw on TV. We saw a popular movement. We saw people coming from universities, not from the mosques. From universities, the educated, ruled or led this mass movement. And we saw women. We saw Christians, young people at the front. The Muslim Brotherhood did not participate, by the way, in the revolution in Egypt. They never participated. All this time, and then Libya started at the same time. So you're seeing, Northern Africa right now. They're taking care of it. The Libya situation, immediately they invited NATO and the bombing of Libya. We had to stop now and think, is this any more a popular movement? What's NATO have to do with it? What's bombing Tripoli and other cities in Libya has to do with people's demands for freedom? Let them get their own freedom. If there is enough, if people are oppressed enough, they'll rise. They will get to what they want. But in Syria, for example, they had to postpone the revolution day twice because nobody showed up the first couple of times. I'm not kidding. It was scheduled for February, I think, 13th and February 25th, and the media would come in where they're supposed to be gathering, and no one showed up. People did not feel it. Syria was living its best days in 2010 and early 2011. Its best days. I visited every year. And people were happy. The reform that Bashar al-Assad did from 2000 to 2010 were obvious. Yes, political reform were not done. Yes, there were reasons for that. Maybe because if your national security is a threat, you're not gonna, give up too much political rights. Sure enough, again, we go back and say the Syrian, eventually it did start. They created some hotspots and started in the outskirts, not in the big city like it did in Egypt. Cairo, Damascus did not go up until right now. All the people that went out in Damascus were in support of the government. Now, we wanted reform, so we were happy to see what happened with Egypt. We really believe that the young are going to rule. It's done with these, old pharaohs. Let's have the young generation rule itself. Suddenly we see that not a single woman made it to the, I don't know, maybe somebody should correct me, but I don't think any young people made it to the parliament. Any women? One young person? Okay. Any women? One? Okay. Any Christians? Coptic? No Coptic? No? Oh wow. No Christian that represent maybe 15% or 10%. Beside the point, the Muslim Brotherhood took over. This is what I'm trying to get to. So it seemed like, from looking at the map, Libya, Tunis, Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood are taking over, even though they did not lead this revolution, so-called. And if today Syria falls, no one kids themselves, no liberal, no other person gonna come to power except the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay? If you read Morsi's letter to President Perez, I'm sure all of you read it, that starts, "My dearest, closest friend," and it ends, "Your most loyal friend." Now don't tell me that these two haven't met before, or at least spoke a few times on the phone before he became president, Morsi. So we understand that it seems like Muslim Brotherhood repackaged themselves, and the Turkey probably presented them to the United States as the future of modern Islam who can rule and keep your interest in the region, will not interfere with Israel. They'll have a peace plan with Israel no matter how humiliating that peace plan is. That's the guarantee that it seems to the Muslim Brotherhood made with the United States and the West. I'm convinced of that now. Back to Syria. President Bashar and the government of Syria responded very positively to the reforms. And I can tell you, we felt all part of that, if you want to call it revolution. We were happy to see the government speeding up the process of reform. Bashar al-Assad came out on the first week into it, said, we were behind. We should have done this 2005. But the war on Iraq, the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, the war on Lebanon, we had refugees. We've taken in 1.5 million Iraqi refugees after the war. When Jordan and Saudi Arabia and every other country shut the doors in front of them, 1.5 million Iraqi, never did we build one tent for them, by the way. They all lived in our homes. Do you see today what happened in northern Syria on the border with Turkey? They built those tents even before the crisis started, preparing for a human crisis to try and have, of course, a demilitarized zone and so on. The Syrians did not bite that. I mean, we went through with it for a few months. That's why AA4Syria didn't start until 6 months ago. First year, we were all sitting around just astonished about what's going on. The turnaround point for me and for most people, even some of the oppositions that are politically opposed to the government, and everyone has the right to oppose the government. I would like to see a different government, more of the young people, and less corruption in Syria. No doubt, there's plenty of corruptions in Syria. There's bribes, there's everything you can think of a government that's been around for 10, 20, 30 years, you are going to have negative things in it. However, the true oppositions do not want to further divide Syria into, different Alawites, Sunni, Druze, the plan further psychospico Syria today, which it seems like part of that oppositions want to do. There's another part of the opposition, which are the most dangerous one, want to turn Syria into an Islamic Khalifa, okay, Khilafa Islamiyya. In 1927, of course, Ataturk abolished the Khilafa Islamiyya, and that's the same year Muslim Brotherhood came into existence, 1927, to really bring the Khilafa Islamiyya back to the Arab world. Things that made us realize that it's not about reforms, it's not about freedom and democracy. Things like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, blowing up the stories. When we speak to our people back home, they tell us, oh, nothing was going on. I mean, people didn't hear it but on the news. And when they took something and they blow up out of proportion, YouTube videos, people running and filming something in the air, and then you see some blood spots. I'm not saying right now there's no war in Syria. There's plenty of blood. But we're talking about the first few months. The more the government gave, the more that vicious campaign, that propaganda campaign against Syria was taking place. Then we saw something very strange. In June, there was a big massacre against army's personnel and their barracks. To me, that was a turnaround point, definitely. Just al-Shugur, there was that's by the way before the army entered the cities in Syria. Okay, there was only policemen, security forces dealing with the crowd. They burned that building to the ground. They killed all 124 young men. There are videos that these people have phoning their family, telling them, saying goodbye. One of them even phoning his officer in Damascus, telling him, you're not going to make it, we're gone, we ran out of ammunition. They didn't take them prisoners. They chopped their heads, they mutilated their bodies, scene that you have never ever imagined you could see. Now guess who was there less than 24 hours later? About 50 media outlets, from CNN and BBC and Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. Of course, only 2 out of the 50 maybe showed it. The Syrian TV, obviously, RT, and Press TV, 3 actually. Okay. Now, Robert Ford was there. He saw this, and he never condemned. The lack of condemnation to this kind of and other attacks that was taking place on civilians just because they belong to a certain sect, or they support the government. There were some really just horrible crimes committed. I would have wished for the opposition to have condemned those crimes. If they said, these people do not represent us, we would have felt closer to this opposition. Until today, we've been for almost a year and 9 months, every time I meet an opposition, I say, would you, for once, condemn the killing that's taking place by the outlaws? I don't want to call them opposition. Why don't you admit that there's other groups in Syria killing based on sectarian identity? They don't want to. They want to convince you that all these anti-Assad groups are all Democrat, pluralist, peace-loving people. Okay, and that's where where finally, yesterday in Reuters, they mentioned there's over 160 different militant groups in Syria today. Different councils, different brigades, different groups, different military, Islamist, mainly by Jabhat al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, which have the most weapons that is flooding Syria right now from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. I don't want to bore you, I don't want to talk too much about that. I want to leave something for Ms. Cynthia McKinney to let us know why Syria and what's the United States position about Syria. We will have question and answer session afterward. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have. There's a lot of topics that of course we can cover, but unfortunately time, we don't have that many of it, too much of it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Johnny.